All right, well, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. My name is Helen Riley, and I work in finance, and I support Lorraine on global marketing, as well as Patrick and David Drummond. But one of the best things about my job is that I head up development together with Lisa Gavelba for Women at Google. And one of the new things that we decided to launch this year was a speaker series. And so I reached out to my colleagues in the People Dev organization, and actually one of the first names that came up was Sally Helgesen. And so I'm delighted to have Sally come talk to us today. So Sally is an internationally acclaimed author and speaker. She's done a number of corporate leadership events with a number of corporations, well-known, IBM, Microsoft, J&J, HP, among others. And she's also the author of 6 books. And her latest book is called The Female Vision. Yeah. It was mixed up, feminine, female, the female vision. And so she's here today to talk to us about some of the lessons from that book. I'm talking about what it is to articulate a clear vision. You know, how do we build allegiances within an organization? How do we, project presence and have executive presence? So a number of things she's going to be talking about. So I'm delighted to hand over to Sally. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks, Helen. Thank you. Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Helen and Women at Google. It's my first visit to the campus, and I love being here. I love seeing all the dogs around. It just puts you in a great mood, and all the bikes. So it's a real pleasure. And what I want to do today is to share some of what I have learned over 25 years of researching and working with women leaders in organizations all around the world. And I want to focus that on things that you as women can do to develop your own leadership style, and for the men in the audience, both in the room and out there in different locations, to also give you some insights in ways that you can drive some of the best talents from the women that you manage. So I'm going to be drawing a lot of information here. I'm going to be focusing on some of the things that I learned both in writing my most recent book, The Female Vision, Women's Real Power at Work, and some of the things that I've learned in the years since, because I've worked with that material to help women in hands-on workshop and coaching situations use the insights and the research in that book to strengthen their own leadership style and position themselves well in their organizations. So that's what I'll be doing. I'm going to do this in pretty much 3 parts. Briefly, I want to give you a bit of background so you can understand where this focus comes from, the kinds of experiences that drove it. Then I want to share with you what I think of as 2 really red-hot insights from the book, The Female Vision. And then I want to have a real discussion about how those insights can be applied to you in the management of your own careers. So let me start by giving you a bit of background. As I said, I've been doing this for 25 years. And my journey working with women leaders and researching women leaders began when I did the research that became the book published in 1990 called The Female Advantage, Women's Ways of Leadership. Book still has been continuously in print and was, I'm very proud to say, the first book that focused on what women had to contribute to organizations rather than how they needed to change and adapt. That had not been out there before. Like many books that really hit a nerve with people, I've never spoken, I once had an Elvis impersonator in the next room in Las Vegas, but there's nothing we can do. We've just got the music? Okay, I'll try to groove with it. The book came from my very personal experience. I had made a career shift in the mid-late 80s. I'd moved from being an independent journalist and writer to working with corporate executives and helping them writing their speeches and working with them to deliver their speeches more effectively. And in making that change, I was concerned about how I was going to be perceived in the organization. I felt like a double outsider. There were very, very few women at the level that I was operating at. So I did two things. I studied the men around me, and I also read a lot of books, because there were books that were being written at that time for women coming into organizations about what they needed to do to be successful. And I got a lot from what I was reading. It was quite helpful to me. But I noticed that every single thing I read focused on how women needed to change their leadership style in order to adapt to the workplace. There was no acknowledgement that women might have something to contribute, or that what they might have to contribute could be valuable to organizations in helping them change and thrive in a rapidly changing environment. One thing I've learned is women are really avid consumers of books about what is wrong with them. But it seemed to me that there was room to look at what women could contribute, and that would be helpful. So I decided to, really on my own initiative, to start interviewing and then doing diary studies. So I was shadowing some of America's best women leaders to try to define what it was that they did that could be powerful for other women to learn from. And it could be powerful for organizations to understand what they had to contribute. The women I studied were very different, ethnically, geographically, in terms of what sector they were in. There was a big range. But what I found was that there were 5 characteristics that these women, often very different, had in common. First, the women placed a very high value on the quality of the relationships that they built, but also the relationships that women generally in their, or that people generally in their organizations were able to build with one another. So they were very relationship focused. The women had a bias for direct communication rather than communication up and down a chain of command. They wanted to talk directly to whomever something concerned. The women like to put themselves in the center of things and lead from the center rather than the top. Some of them even put their offices in the center of their organizations and create what I called webs of inclusion to draw people in around them. The women were comfortable with, as opposed to tolerant of, diversity. They themselves had been outsiders and had fresh eyes for understanding the kinds of things, the kind of value that an outsider perspective could provide. And they also knew from personal experience what condescending behavior felt like. And finally, the women were skilled at integrating their personal and their professional lives. And drawing on, a number of them said to me, made a point of saying, you know, I'm the same person at work that I am at home, as a mother, as a sister, as a wife, as a member of my community. And that gives me a real source of strength. And they were good at drawing information from their private lives and using it at work, and vice versa. Now, what has been really extraordinary in my experience is to watch over the last, so that was put out there in 1990, and those characteristics have become in the years since really thought of and often defined as women's leadership characteristics. But what has been amazing is to watch the way in which those characteristics have become much more mainstream and recognized as characteristics of excellent leaders in general. That I've been able to witness that, and it has been really extraordinary. And it is because the environment, the economic environment that we're part of, technology, and of course demographic change have all supported the recognition of those leadership characteristics as important. As organizations have had to connect more directly with customers and clients, they've gotten more focused on relationships. I'll tell you, when the Female Advantage came out and I talked about that value the women placed on relationships, I was told, don't go there, because talking about relationships makes it sound very soft, and it's not good for women. Now every bank wants to have a relationship with you. There's a real emphasis on the value of relationships. Obviously, comfort with diversity, more and more important as we have more diverse and globalized workforce. The ability to put yourself in the center of things rather than the top, more adaptive as more work gets done in teams and webs. The ability to integrate personal and professional, again, more important, more adaptive as we move into a 24/7 environment. And obviously a bias for direct communication is more and more of a necessary skill given the nature of networked technologies. So it has been extraordinary to watch this sort of confluence between what I saw women often bringing to organizations where these characteristics had not been defined as leadership characteristics, and the way in which the environment was demanding these qualities. In fact, it was so interesting to me, a couple months ago, Tom Friedman, the New York Times columnist, did a series called What It Takes to Work at Google, in which he interviewed Laszlo Bock and talked about what leadership characteristics Google was looking for. And I wrote a blog about it because I blog for Strategy and Business magazine. The extraordinary overlap between what Bock was describing as desirable characteristics for leaders, especially collaborative skill, relationship building, the ability to work seamlessly in webs and teams, and assume different positions within them, putting yourself in the middle. And I thought, it is extraordinary that what Bock is describing 25 years ago, 20 years ago, were really considered women's leadership strengths. And I think that has been very much to the advantage, not only of many women, but it has also freed many men to explore other sides of themselves and recognize that they could be strong leaders while doing that. So I think it has been a very good thing. That said, about 2006 or 2007, even I, who tend to be a glass half full type person, began to think, now, there's something amiss here. If women are bringing these skills often to organizations, and these skills are becoming recognized more as mainstream leadership skills, and organizations are often hiring women at 50%, and women are becoming increasingly represented at the top in terms of business and professional schools, why aren't there more women at the very top, where they're making the kinds of decisions that have the real strategic influence on the direction of their organizations and on our society as a whole? Why is there a leadership barrier or gap still in place, especially given this confluence between what women bring and what organizations increasingly need? And what caught my eye as I pondered this, and a lot of other people who are in this field generally were thinking about that then and still are, what struck me were two studies that I came across, one done in Madrid, one done at INSEAD, the sort of the HBS of France and Europe generally, both of which were big global studies, and both of which showed the same thing. What they showed is that when interviewing senior leaders in organizations about where they saw women's strengths and women's weaknesses, the kinds of characteristics we've been talking about, collaboration, relationship building, direct communication, negotiation, the senior leaders felt that the women that in their organizations demonstrated them, but consistently, what those senior leaders said, the point where they felt women had a weakness or needed to develop more strength, was around the question of vision. Big picture thinking, long-term focus. So the executives in these two huge global studies were critical of their women in terms of their capacity for vision, and this was an impediment to women's perception of being ready for leadership. And what was fascinating also in the study, because women often routinely tend to under-assess themselves and their skills based on how they're perceived by others, is the women didn't see this gap at all. The women felt that they had a strong vision, that they had long-term, that they were represented long-term thinking and big picture focus very well. So I thought, something isn't translating here. Maybe it's time to explore what vision really is in organizations, and where there may be a gap, where women's vision may not be translating in organizations so that it can be understood and recognized and valued by senior leaders. Doing that seemed to me an extremely worthwhile project, because in doing so, I thought there's an opportunity to, on one hand, help women to better understand the nature of their vision and articulate it in a way that can be heard. And at the same time, there's an opportunity to help organizations recognize the power of vision that women have the capacity to bring. So this became my quest. This became sort of, in my view, the next frontier that we needed to research and get some ideas and some answers for in terms of the next area, think about development of leadership capacity for women. So that's what I began focusing on. And I want to very briefly share two insights from the really huge research project that I undertook with a team to identify and articulate what the female vision is and where its power could reside. And then we'll open it up and start to look at what does this mean for you next Monday morning in terms of building a leadership style that can lead you to make a contribution that really reflects your best talents, your true talents, and create a career for yourself that's very satisfying in the course of doing that. The two insights, so I want to do this briefly. The first one, and this I think is really a big deal. What we learned, not just from doing interviews and case studies, but also from working with some neuroscientific labs at UCLA and Columbia that were doing research on what happens when people's brains are operating. What we learned is that, and of course we're humans, so there's always a spectrum here. It's not all men are this way and all women are that way. But what we learned is that in general, women's attention tends to operate in some distinctive ways. What women notice, which is a building block of vision. Think about, what is vision? Vision is what you notice, then it's what you value about what you notice, and then it's the story you tell yourself about why what you're noticing is important. So notice is really the building block of vision, this primary building block. And what we found is that women tend to notice a lot of things at once. And this is verifiable in neuroscientific labs when they hook people up to functional MRIs and watch the brain in operation. Women are noticing all the time. They're noticing different things at once. Their attention is scanning and operating kind of like a radar, and they're processing in parallel a lot of information from different sources. Whereas men tend to have a much more focused style of noticing, looking at one thing at a time, focusing in on it, with their attention operating more like a laser rather than a radar. And this matters. This matters when we think about leadership, because in many organizations, focused notice is perceived of and privileged as a leadership style. And those who have a more broad spectrum notice, as we called it in the book, are thought of sometimes as being all over the place by those who have very focused notice. I can give you an example, a day-to-day example of how this operates and what some of the consequences are. Right here in the Bay Area, I spent some time with a woman, Susan Bernstein. She'd gotten her MBA, she joined a hotshot consulting firm, and when she came in, she was told, you know, your first big client case, your first big meeting, I want you to go to that. Don't say anything, just notice. Just notice what is going on in that room. So Susan went to the meeting, and she noticed. And what she noticed was that the two chief clients on this project couldn't stand one another, nor could their staffs. That it was there in their body language. There was a real feeling of tension in the room. And when she came back to her meeting and she was asked, what did you notice? She said that. She said, what I noticed, the big thing I noticed is that these two guys seem to be at one another's throats. And what she was told was, that's not what you were supposed to notice. You're not there as an HR consultant. You are there as a business consultant. What you were supposed to notice was the presentation and the numbers. How did you think they added up? And she said, I went away from that meeting thinking, boy, did I blow it. I will never do that again. And she said, I spent the next 7 years in that organization suppressing my capacity to notice what was going on among people so that I could better fit the mold. She said, and the result of that was that I lost my passion for what I was doing because I felt inauthentic. I felt as if I was constantly using energy to suppress what my best observations were. And she said, and oh, by the way, 6 months after I joined that team, that project blew up, and it blew up not because the numbers were poor, but because these two guys were at one another's throats and ended up in a lawsuit that, in fact, involved us. He said, so there was a real consequence for me suppressing that. But I still knew, and I understood, and I was given to understand that that information was not what my company wanted me to hear. So there's an example of the cost of suppressing the power of what you notice. It seemed very, very clear to me. And one of the things that I have come to believe is that this capacity for broad spectrum notice is something that in 10 or 15 years we will really recognize as a leadership attribute, in the same way that we have come to recognize skill at collaboration, relationship building, and direct communication as a strong leadership attribute. I think that because organizations are changing so rapidly and innovation is so much a part of where organizational value gets defined, that capacity for broad spectrum notice will become more important. And the more prepared we are to recognize what it is and articulate its value in a way, and this is what we'll be getting to in the sort of how-to part of this, that laser-like noticers can understand, the more opportunity we'll have to position ourselves for leadership and for being able to leverage the power of that. I think that's going to happen. After about a couple months after the Female Vision came out, I had an interview with Jeff Immelt, the chair and CEO of GE. And he was asked, what is the number one leadership capability that GE is going to be hiring for and training for in the years ahead? And what he said was the capacity to see around the corners. because that's what's needed in today's environment. And I thought, how are you going to see around the corners unless you're skilled at harnessing both broad spectrum and focused notice? When they work together, you've got an opportunity to get more information than you would if it were alone. So I'm going to stop for a moment, and because that's a certain amount of material. I do have one other insight from the book, and then we'll drill down more onto asking you to think about how this might apply to you. But are there any questions here on the question of notice, or on the leadership capabilities that we've been discussing, or the way in which those have become more recognized as mainstream? Has that been your experience? Do you have anything that you can share on that?
It's actually rather enlightening for you to say that broad spectrum notice, or the women aren't considered to have much vision, is one of the things you want to point out, because actually I left my last role because my manager, a male manager, said I didn't have any strategy or vision. And I said, well, you're ignoring the project I've been spending most of my time doing, which is a strategic vision for the next step. And I came over here to Google in order to work for a woman who I think thinks I have strategy and vision now. But I think my question then is, if you feel that you do have strategy and vision, how do you express that to someone who thinks you don't?
Someone who thinks you don't. So this will get us a little more. We can do this. Move into what some of the practices that I've been talking about that we'll be focusing on here. So let me get into that and answer to your question, because I think that's sort of the key question here. How do you, if you think, like the women in the studies, if you think you've got strong vision and a strategic way of thinking, how do you, as it were, translate that to somebody who may have a very narrow noticing style, and therefore is judging you as someone who doesn't, because you're not articulating it in ways that they're comfortable with? How do you do that? And most of this I've really learned since the book came out, working with women to develop their capacity to articulate and translate what their vision is. A couple things that I think are important, and some of them come from talking to Susan Bernstein afterwards, 7, 8 years afterwards. One of the questions I asked her is, what would you have done differently when you came into that meeting and said, I noticed these two guys were at one another's throats? Is there a different way you would have handled that? And she said a couple things that I think are really helpful in thinking about how to do this, how to translate this capacity. She said, first of all, these are real data guys. You know, they're MBAs. They think, live, breathe, eat numbers. She said, first of all, I would have gone in, and the first thing I would have done would be to address what they were interested and show them, you know, I saw the numbers, this is how I, you know, perceived them, rather than saying, this is the main thing I noticed. She said, because right away, what I learned with them is they were going to see that as to some degree off topic. So getting out of the way, addressing what I understood was important to them, would have been helpful to me. She said, secondly, I should have been more data-like in my presentation of what I noticed, rather than just saying, and I noticed this, and then trying to give the details, you know, so-and-so's admin seemed to sit in a place that the other admin was sitting, you know, all these kind of little details that she was giving to justify or explain what she noticed. She said, I wish I had presented that more as data, going in and saying something like, here's what I noticed about the numbers, here's what I think is important about that. I will say that in order for this to happen, and that to happen, and that to happen, we need to have a real strong commitment from the two principals, because here's one way that could fall apart, here's another way that could fall apart, so that I was really explaining to them why I thought it was important for them, for their bottom line, for what they were concerned about, that these two principals were on the same page. She said, and then if I had said, and I have concerns about how long-term their commitment to one another is, and I can share with you the reasons for those concerns offline. She said, because in a way, these guys were a little bit uncomfortable with that kind of material. So I can explain that to you when we're offline, if you'd like. But I have concerns, and here I think are some of the potential consequences for us, for our division, if there are problems down the line. Here are a couple scenarios. She said, I could have even had a slide or two about what these scenarios were. She said, in other words, if I had really translated that into a style of presentation that they were comfortable with, rather than presenting it as very contextual and almost as they would see it, subjective, I think I would have had a better shot. She said, but the other thing I learned is the big mistake I made was to back off and to immediately think, oh boy, I blew it. And to take that to heart and pull away from it. She said, because she said, I should have gone in there really prepared to not argue the case, but present the case for why this was important and represent that. She said, because that's really the vision part. She said, my vision here is we needed to address this issue. We needed to recognize this issue. We needed to be prepared for the kinds of things that could go wrong because of this issue. That was my vision. That's what I saw. She said, and I needed to explain it in terms that they understood. And I needed to be prepared to defend myself instead of just quickly backing off. So I think that's sort of the takeaway here is be prepared to, I don't want to use the word defend it, but be prepared to back it up and stand your ground. But know that in presenting what you have to present, if you're presenting to a very bottom line, get to the point, focused notice, boss, or someone you want to be able to articulate that in a way that they are comfortable with and where they're not being asked to imagine a situation that they're not very good at noticing or judging, because that's going to then make them feel like, how did I miss that? Is there something wrong with me? Clearly not. She's one of these touchy-feely women who's all concerned about what people's relationships are with one another. That's not really what we're here for. We're business consultants. So she said she could have really handled that differently and understood that bringing both perspectives together could be really valuable. There's one other thing I want to say, because I've gotten very aware of this kind of presentation since the book came out and since I've worked with some women. I've worked down in San Diego for a while with women in a biotech firm who are having real problems presenting what some of their research points are, because they were getting critiqued as being all over the map. So we were really trying to almost reverse engineer and figure out what do you need in this presentation about this data? What is going to set these guys at ease? And in watching, because I would we do some role playing, but in watching some of the presentations, here's one thing I saw over and over. Women would often start with a kind of backstory to let their listeners know how they came up with what they came up with. Said, well, you know, I'm going to tell you how I came to this research point. And I'll tell you this research point in a moment, but let me tell you how I got there. Let me tell you the process by which I got there. I was having a conversation with so-and-so. You've lost them already. If you've got a really tightly focused noticer, a laser-like guy, his mind almost clicks off when you start to tell him what the backstory is. Much more powerful, because we've gone through this. we've gone through this process and watched it work. Much more powerful is to be able to present it in a very focused, data-like way, and then say, if you're interested at some point in how I got to this, be glad to share it with you, but not do it as the opener. Because often women use personal stories to establish relationship as a way of sharing and preparing to share information. And often, not always, there are men who are very different than this, but often with men in real business situations, that's not cultural for them, and it's not something they're comfortable with. So it can certainly be surmounted, and this was one of my goals in developing and looking at, what is a female vision, how can that be incorporated? Part of it is, how do we interpret it? So, great question. Does that help? Thanks. Mm-hmm.
About describing things to an audience that is more laser-like in their focus, and starting with data and then offering to tell a personal story if it would be helpful at the end.
Correct.
I feel like striking that balance is really hard. Mm-hmm. I know that when I, in the past have started with telling a personal story or making a personal connection, that it has been met at times with skepticism, and then you lose your audience and then you can't get it back. And I feel like I've overcorrected now. Now I feel like I don't talk about myself as often. I don't make those personal connections. I don't share those stories because I've overcorrected after having been met with this skepticism.
Yeah.
And I do feel like, especially at Google, it's helpful to tell those personal stories and make those personal connections, even with people with a laser-like focus.
Yeah.
And so, getting it right here, I think, has been a challenge because, I understand what you're talking about, but I feel like this environment may be a little unique, at least on the legal team, I think, where I work.
Uh-huh. I love that because I have watched women do this, and the biotech team that I was working with for a while, that began to happen. They began to, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to do the data thing, and suddenly they had lost their personality. And, women are often very ripe to be criticized, and it was like, well, she's a robot. She doesn't seem to have any warmth or personality. This is what happened to Susan Bernstein, the woman up in the Bay Area, when up in the East Bay, when she said, I lost who I was. I lost part of what my authentic value was. And she said, I remember years ago I read a fantastic quote from a woman that just, to me, epitomized what happens when you lose your authenticity at work. She said, sometimes I feel as if my body is only a vehicle to carry my head to the computer. And to me, that sort of encapsulates everything we want to avoid as people. And I think that comes when you suppress what's good in yourself. So what you're doing, what you're noticing, you're noticing that you overcorrected, is part of a process, I believe, of coming to a very strong and authentic way of being in the world and presenting yourself. On one hand, you had the confidence and the humility to notice that the way you were presenting wasn't necessarily landing in the way you wanted. So you made corrections, but then you're open to also noticing that you corrected too far. And you're searching to find that balance point. But you can't search to find that balance point unless you're aware of what both feel like. And it sounds as if you are. So I would say that this is really part of this process to getting toward a very strong and authentic way of presenting what your vision is. And that one of the things I hope is that being able to recognize and articulate some of these differences, putting it in the frame of laser and radar notice, and recognizing where your own capabilities and comfort level lies, that in itself can be helpful in identifying what the issue is, and then in coming to understand how to take action. Okay. Let me go to the one other quick insight from the book that I'd like to share. And then we'll do more of this in terms of focusing on what it means to you. Talk about vision. So it's what you notice. Then the next step is what you value. So one thing we were really wanted to learn was, what are the similarities and differences in what men and women really value about their work, about their experience in the organizations they're part of? Where is that overlap? How does that happen? So we ran out because when you ask a question about what you value, it can be pretty abstract. So what we did was we ran out a big study looking at similarities and differences in how men and women perceive, define, and pursue satisfaction at work. And what we found, so it was a big study. We used Harris Interactive to deliver it to a huge sample of people at a variety of levels, director and above, in organizations. And what we found is that there were some strong similarities between what men and women valued. They wanted to be recognized. They wanted to feel authentic at work. They recognized for their real achievements. They took great satisfaction in being a part of a team or leading a team. And they took great satisfaction in achieving goals and being able to check those off. But we found two areas of significant difference in terms of value. And I think this has a real impact in terms of how you think about your vision and positioning yourself in the organization. The two areas that were different were, first of all, women tended to define their success based on their own terms that they had set for themselves, whereas the men in the study really defined success almost exclusively in competitive terms. I came out ahead of him, and therefore I'm satisfied. So it was very competitive in terms of how they perceived success, whereas women were more likely to have their own benchmarks for success. And the other thing was that women were more focused upon and tended to judge as satisfying the everyday experience of work that they had. Whereas the men that we studied were more likely to perceive satisfaction based on position and monetary reward. Position and monetary reward were important for women, not saying that, but they were important to women in the context of also having a satisfying experience of every day, and that experience was often defined by the ability to develop high-quality relationships and maintain them over time, and by the capacity to some extent control their own pace at work. And these differentials, I think, really do matter. And when we think about it, one of the things that we see is that organizations, given this, often define motivation or assume motivation based on primarily male criteria. The idea is competitive ranking will be a spur to performance. Maybe, maybe not. It's kind of a diversity issue. Competitive ranking isn't going to be a spur to performance for everyone. And yet we see, we even see organizations even now adopting these competitive curves, which can be very problematic. And this strikes me as not much of an issue here, which makes my heart sing, I will say. It seems that there's real attention here to what the quality of people's experience is, at least from the optics. And that is really important for creating organizations that really motivate women to develop their best. What is the everyday experience? One thing we found when we interviewed women who had left high positions that were very monetarily satisfying, what we found they tended to say was to do something else. They'd say, I decided it just wasn't worth it. Meaning, while the money and the position were great, those weren't as profoundly intrinsic to what my values were, because my everyday experience was not fulfilling, because I didn't feel like I had any control over my pace, for example. I didn't feel that I could value that. So I think it's really important in organizations, and this is something for everybody who's out there to think about. To some extent, you know, we're looking at diversity as an issue so often, but motivation is a diversity issue as well. People are motivated by different things. And it's really helpful for us as individuals to recognize what really motivates us and to share that information, because that's helpful to the organization, it's helpful to our bosses, what really gets us engaged. And it's not going to be the same for everyone. So I think that's an important point. Any question or observation on this?
So in my old job in public accounting, I felt like every time there was a happy hour or like an employee appreciation thing, it was always like, here's a bunch of food and alcohol. And it was like, that was kind of like what they felt, like how they felt like they were like paying people back or thanking them. And I like tried multiple times kind of to talk to HR and say like, I would much more appreciate like a massage or a spa day or something like where I could relax. That was what would make me feel appreciated, as opposed to like here, like you just worked like 80-hour weeks, so like drink all the alcohol you want. Yeah. Like that's like get your money back that way, you know? So I think it was like, it was never something that they really valued or like really tried to change, or like, let's do a wine tasting class. Like even if you want to do alcohol, like let's do something a little bit different than like greasy food and a happy hour. So that was just like an observation, just like for that, like just not listening really, or like really trying to see like what would motivate people or can make them feel appreciated. And
it sounds like there's a reason you're not there anymore.
Yes.
And that it's a kind of mismatch of values. And I think more and more, I mean, this is one of the gifts that women, and also I think a younger generation, which is well represented here, of workers are bringing in. Being more in touch with what really motivates them, a greater understanding of that, and a willingness to do what you did, which was to try to tell them, you may find, you know, there are people here who find this highly motivating and rewarding, then there are people like me who don't find it that motivating. Why not look more broadly to think about what could engage people? And what I see with organizations is more focus on how do we engage diverse employees, but often not thinking of that in terms of motivation and reward. And I believe that is something that's going to be changing over the next 10 years, that there's going to be much more recognition that, I mean, in the old days, you know, they'd give recognition to a male executive would be a mink stole for his wife. You know, how generic can you get? So we're moving to something that's kind of the madman era. We're moving to something that is much more customized, and we're really part of that. So, 3 things, looking at what this can mean for those of you who are here and out there in terms of how you think about your own leadership capacity. We've talked a bit about how important it is to articulate what you see, the power of what you see, the value of what you notice, in a way that those who have a different spectrum of notice can understand. If you would, responsibility to think about how you're going to translate that in order to really stand behind it strongly. But there's another aspect of the notice duality that I think is important to understand, and it has to do with not expecting those who have a very focused notice to notice certain things about you. Had a great example of it right here in the Valley with a young woman engineer, I think, said electronic arts or something. I'm not remembering because it was a big workshop. Anyway, Ellen Isaacs, I do remember her name and I remember her face. And we were talking about this noticing business and what different people notice. And she said, you know, I had the best example of that. This really helps me understand something. She said, I've always thought of myself as a real go-to person in the organization. People contact me about things that might not even relate directly to my job. I get lots of calls, lots of emails, people in and out of my office. She said, and a couple weeks ago, we went off-site on a retreat where we had our performance review done. She said, and my boss was there, my performance review came back, we had to talk about it. She said, and basically what he said was, she's terrific, she does very high quality work, but she's not broadly enough connected in the organization. She seems to spend a lot of time in her office, and she thought, what? The very thing I think I'm best at, he doesn't notice? How can that be possible? And she said she spent some time after that really feeling bad, wondering if she should work for the guy who she really liked working for, and just kind of taking it to heart. She said, I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach to be criticized on the thing I felt I was best about. She said, but listening to this, she said, what I realized is I was expecting him to notice something that he may not, just is kind of not in his radar span for noticing. How would he know how broadly connected I am? I never told him. He doesn't monitor my emails, see who comes into my office. He doesn't monitor my phone calls. I had never told him. She said, so what I realized I had to do was come up with a way to share this information with him explicitly. So she began a kind of program for herself where she, every 2 weeks, she sent him an email saying, talked to so-and-so, connected these two people, et cetera, et cetera. She said, I felt so nervous about doing that. I felt so frightened about doing that. I thought he was going to say, why is she wasting my time with this? Why is she blowing her own horn all of a sudden to me? She said his response was, this is information I need to know because what you're doing is strengthening me. Because you work for me, you are building my connections and I need to know that information. So she had a real recognition of the power of handling that well and getting past this sort of shyness about articulating what she was doing to her boss, but really also recognizing I went in there expecting he would just notice things that I might notice, even though I had plenty of information to let me know that that's not how he saw things. He wasn't always saying, I wonder what Ellen's doing. I wonder if Ellen knows this person. She said it wasn't on his radar screen. It's not really how he thinks. So that's the other side of the notice. So you're thinking about your vision, and I think it's really important for us to articulate and to have in mind really an idea for describing what our vision is. Whenever we're in a job, what is my vision for what I could be doing in this job, and how does that fit with a larger vision I have of what could be helpful for this organization? The more you can articulate that and have it almost in your back pocket, the more powerful it will be. But also, what's great about doing that is you can use the vision that you have to begin to build allies in a very strategic way. In organizations today, there's so much emphasis on getting a mentor and getting a sponsor and all that. And I thought Sheryl Sandberg did a great job of addressing why that can sometimes be problematic. Certainly, I've worked in organizations where the women who are in very senior positions are besieged with requests to be mentors and sponsors in often a way that's somewhat inorganic. And I think that the emphasis on it, although it's very, very helpful and important, and I've seen organizations where women's opportunities are transformed by mentoring and sponsorship programs. But allies, sponsors and mentors are one kind of ally. And allies can be peers. They can be people who report to us. They're people who are engaged in helping you achieve what you want, and who recognize that in doing that, they can strengthen themselves as well. That's what an ally is. So it's not necessarily a level. And I believe that women can really strengthen themselves by using the vision that they articulate to enlist allies. Women are great at building relationships in general, but they're not always as great at leveraging relationships, as making sure those relationships help them achieve what they're trying to achieve, and helping the people who are allied with them also achieve what their objectives are. Often we can be shy about saying, this is what I'm trying to do, this is how you can help me, and this is how you can benefit from that. And oh, by the way, what can I do for you? One thing I've noticed, and I've had this discussion often with people in HR, and I had this discussion with headhunters as well, is women will come into a position and think, I need to get really good at this. I'm going to keep my head down for the next 6 months, and I'm going to master this job, and then I can look up and start to bring people in around me. Whereas often you'll find a successful male will go into a job, and his first question is, who do I need to reach out to who can help me make this a success? So right away he's engaging people. Who is going to help me be successful at this? And the result is that he has more support and more visibility for what he does. That keeping your head down and trying to become an expert can cost you in terms of visibility and support. So it's something that I always have urged, and the reasons and the techniques around it change over time. But for women, it's really important to think, once you have articulated what you're trying to do, who can help me build this? How can I bring people in? How can I leverage their skills? I did a program at a huge global financial institution in DC based, a couple months ago. It was a big women's program. There were hundreds of women there. And they were in a place of some degree of discouragement. And what I learned was that the organization had recently done a survey on who people preferred as bosses. And men and women both perceived that having a male boss was more desirable. And I was fascinated by this. So once we'd done our program, I said, can I do some backgrounding here? Can I learn a little more about why this was, what it is in your culture that was responsible for that? What I learned were two things. First of all, in that environment where there were very few women who were bosses, women were often perceived of as tougher bosses because they were so invested in doing things kind of perfectly themselves that they seemed to have less tolerance. But the other thing which relates to this is that men were perceived to have better connections in the organization as a whole. And people wanted to be on a team where their boss had a lot of connections because they understood and recognized that that was going to be good for them down the line. So to the extent that you're not building alliances and connections, that's going to have an impact upon also how your team perceives you. So I think it's something really important. And again, building relationships is not always the same thing as leveraging them. Remember we talked about Susan Bernstein saying, I wish I had been able to stand up for what I saw. And standing up, I think, is something that we need to think about. I have been asked for 25 years what women need to do to build a stronger, more effective leadership presence. Do women need to have a firmer handshake? Is it how we walk? What we're wearing? Should you carry a purse into a meeting? Are you making yourself look weaker if you're carrying a purse or encumbered in other ways? It's always cosmetic what the questions are. But having spent 25 years working with some of the best women leaders, best leaders around the world, I've come to the conclusion that what really builds leadership presence is the capacity to be present. To be present in the moment for the person in front of you, for the task in front of you, for the actual situation that you're in. And there is a reason that the word presence and present are essentially the same. Those are connected. And what's rather daunting about this is that in a 24/7 environment that we're part of, where technology is a part of how we're interacting all the time, it can be difficult to build, to be responsive, to do your job, but in the course of doing that, also build the kind of leadership presence that gives you real strength and makes you perceived of as a leader. Because the environment we're part of is inherently distracting. Years ago, before I got into this at all, I said I had done a lot of speech writing for executives. And it was so fascinating because when I go to conferences and working with the executives, you could always tell who the executive was because he, never saw a woman in those days, he was unencumbered and he didn't have anything he was worried about. Everybody else was worried about what was going on. But he didn't need to worry about where are my notes or what's happening, or where is this, or what's the right door, or oh, it's raining, how am I going to get to the door, or carrying a raincoat. It's fine. Things were taken care of and he could be present. Sometimes he wasn't, because sometimes he was the kind of guy who couldn't look anybody in the eye. But he had that capacity. And what's fascinating is to look at the extent to which the environment we're part of can undermine our capacity to be present, but even as it does so, it weakens our ability to really manifest presence. And I do think that it can be harder for women, partly because of our radar. That capacity to be noticing how things are landing on somebody, or how engaged someone is, noticing what's going on in the room. That radar-like capacity, while it has real strength, also has the potential to undermine our ability to be fully present. So what I've seen are a number of practices, I'd share 3 today, that really are helpful in being able to maintain the capacity to be fully present, which I believe is absolutely essential for sending a message about your potential as a leader. People get that. We get it at a level that's here rather than here. We understand when someone is present or when they're not. And we understand it across cultures. That's something else I think that's really important. People can recognize, we have all these training programs, if you're in a meeting and someone's a Muslim, don't show the bottom of your shoe, and all these kinds of techniques we get at communicating across culture. But people understand and recognize if you're present across culture. That's something that really translates. So I believe it is a tremendous advantage to all of us to think about what do we need to do to be as present as we can. What I've seen work is, number 1, be your own HR department. And by that I mean think through what policies, what practices do you need to incorporate into how you do things that protect your ability to be thoughtful and effective rather than constantly responding? What works for you? We're all different in this way. And that's why I say be your own HR department, because this isn't something that can be handed down as policy. If we're really starting from the point of what is going to help me be present and be effective and be thoughtful, what do I need to do to enable that to happen? How do I need to use my time and my technology and my interactions in a way that will really support that? So some real mindfulness and intention around doing that. When we're going into a new project, negotiate our time needs in advance as much as we can. It's not an ideal world, but negotiate that in time and sell maybe sell up. I did some work at Microsoft, and this woman that was a general manager there when I was talking about this, she said, you know, what I did is I realized that the constant stream of text was really undermining me. And I talked to my boss and said, I'm going to do an experiment where I turn this off for a certain number of hours a day, and I will not be able to necessarily respond. She said, and I was able to kind of sell that to him. And then I was able to, speaking of data, document how it improved my effectiveness. So that became part of my policy for how I managed my time. So I think that setting policies is really important. The second thing, and I think this is particularly important for women, in my experience, is to recognize and address compulsive or addicting multitasking. Women often take pride in their capacity to multitask. And the world we live in, we all multitask. I'm not advocating. I mean, sometimes I've given this talk, and I get into the elevator, and some woman's in the elevator on her cell phone. She says, "Oh, I'm sorry. It's, you know, she's almost defending me because she feels like, oh, she thinks I'm multitasking. We live in a world that requires a certain degree of multitasking, but it is important to recognize that while it is efficient, there is always a cost. Because if you are doing two things at once, you by definition cannot be present for both of them. Your attention is divided, your attention is fractured, you're more likely to make mistakes, and it is inherently more stressful. Because stress is produced when our attention is divided, not when we're working hard. That's what is stressful. I've got to do this. Oh, what time is the plane going to come? And then I've got to get there, and maybe I should recalculate. That's where stress lives. Stress lives in divided attention. And the more present one can be, and again, I feel that I've watched this and witnessed this by being exposed to highly effective senior executives. They have the resources that help them to be present because they're not worrying about the details. Most of us don't have that luxury. We have to worry, we have to sweat the details. But the more we can do that in a way where we're mindful of where is this addictive? Where is this habitual? How important is it that I respond to this right now? And the more we can protect our effectiveness, the more leadership presence we will be able to affect, and the more we'll be able to represent and gain respect for and understanding of what our vision is. And the final thing is, as Buddhists recognize, presence is a practice. Being present is a practice, and that's what meditation and meditational pursuits are about. They're a way of practicing being present. And presence is not something you can just tell yourself, I'm going to be present. I've decided, starting now, I'm going to be fully present. It doesn't work that way. It's something that you incorporate into your being, and you do that through practice. Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese monk, has a wonderful practice that he uses when he works with people in offices. He says, every time that phone rings, every time you hear that bell, use it like monks in a monastery use a monastery bell. Take 1 second to call yourself to attention and to presence. Take a breath when you hear it. Let your practice be to remind you when you hear a bell, when you hear the text ping, whatever it is. I'm here now. I'm present. I'm in the moment. I am here. And if you can do that, you can begin to develop that muscle that enables you to be present. And by the way, you'll be a lot more effective when you pick up the phone rather than, yeah, you'll be, can I help you? That's much more present. So thinking of it in terms of presence. And I think this is something that's very powerful. I said, that presence translates across culture. It even translates across species, which is a big deal. If anybody watched Cesar, the dog whisperer, that's all he does. You know, the dog owners walk into their house and the dog goes nuts. Cesar walks in, dog is total attention. And all it is he is fully present and aware. So if that can translate across species, anybody who's tried to ride a horse knows how that effective is if you're thinking about 10 different things at once. So being able to bring that practice into what you do is going to help you represent your vision with real power and authority and influence. And oh, by the way, you'll be much less stressed and distracted in the process.
So you mentioned Sheryl Sandberg. I'm curious, what are Sheryl Sandberg's book? I was actually curious your thoughts in terms of the lean-in kind of decree for women.
Well, first of all, I think Sheryl's book was one of the great contributions of the last 10 years. What I see is it has gotten companies thinking much more at a much higher level about what they need to do to engage women. And it's made it acceptable. I did a program at a big energy company that was very traditional and top-down, and they had a male panel, which I was moderating, and all 4 men on the panel showed up carrying her book to kind of show how on board they were. So it's kind of given men, I think because of her status, permission to be interested in this issue, which is extremely important. And many, many of the points she made, I thought, were really very important. It doesn't just happen, leadership. It involves that stepping up and making that commitment and saying, I really want this to work. This may not be the place. I may need to go to another place, but I really want to invest in my career. And I think that's what she was saying. And I so disliked the criticism that, well, easy for her to say. She's got all these resources. That's not the point. The point is she was encouraging and saying you can have a richer, fuller, more meaningful life if you invest yourself in your career. On the other hand, this propensity of women to look at the actual quality of their day is something that is pretty deeply ingrained. I don't think it has to be an either or. On one hand, it doesn't have to be so non-strategic. Well, I'm not enjoying this particular job. I've had 5 bad days in a row. I think I'm going to quit. That's, that is not leaning in. That is not stepping up. That's getting discouraged. What we find is that over time, if day after day after day, the experience of work is profoundly unsatisfying, women are more likely to say, that salary, that position was not worth it because I am just not enjoying my life. I believe this is one of the great gifts that women have to bring to the workplace, because I've read a lot of research about the millennial generation and what they value, and it's much more similar to what women value. It's that interest in what is the quality of my life. I'm moving into organizations. I know I'm going to be working 60 hours a week if I'm going to get anywhere. I know how much my job is going to be all-consuming. I need to be able to enjoy it. I need to be able to feel as if my contribution is really valued. I want to feel a part of what I'm doing. And that's what we hear from the men and women of that millennial generation, who come into, people say, oh, they're so entitled. Well, first of all, their parents, told them good job when they, picked up a quarter. They've been told over and over, you're terrific, you can do anything. And so, of course, they have that attitude. And I happen to believe that attitude can be very adaptive in today's workplace because so much of it is expected of us. But one of the things I often say, and I say to executives who are saying, our women seem to feel like work should be enjoyable, I say, be grateful, because you have an opportunity to think through the experience of work at this place and prepare yourself for that next generation whose attitude is much more likely to be similar to that of women. So this is, again, I believe what happened, like with those leadership competencies, is women are to a degree on the cutting edge of how organizations will need to adapt to be able to really engage their talent at the highest level. And that it is helpful, it behooves, to use an old-fashioned word, organizations to be able to listen to that, and it's helpful for us in terms of really making that case. I did not see in Cheryl's book this big divide between stepping up and valuing the quality of your everyday. Obviously, every day isn't going to be a picnic, and there are days that are going to be extremely difficult. It's really over time when you begin to perceive a misfit or a mismatch, like a woman Susan Bernstein did, as a result of feeling I cannot be authentic in this job. But it's also possible, I mean, again, that woman Ellen Isaacs that I met out here in the Valley, who felt so discouraged because she felt like her boss didn't see what she really had, what her best qualities were. There are ways we can address that if we have an awareness of it. There are ways we can make that better. And she reported that that made an enormous difference to her, that she felt like her boss really saw, really noticed her and noticed what was best about her. And that was profoundly rewarding to her and gave her much more feeling of freedom and much more feeling like she really fit with this organization. So I think the message is hopeful. I felt Cheryl's message was very hopeful and very hands-on in terms of specific advice. And, you know, as I said, I've been doing this 25 years. And one of the advantages of that is being able to take a big picture, long-term view. And I believe this is the best time I have ever seen in 25 years for women to be able to make an impact and help their organizations really use their best talents. It takes being able to articulate and understand the power of what those best talents are. But I think we're in a time where organizations are certainly, in my view, more ready to hear that than they have been in decades. So I wish you luck, and I thank you.